This Pioneer Field agronomist Scott Everskirt with a week of May 28th agronomy update. Looks like another usual year in southern Illinois. Got some areas that are getting dry, some areas that are still wet. We've got corn being planted, we've got corn knee-high, got beans being planted, and we got beans being post-sprayed. So just a lot of variability across the southern part of the state. From a corn standpoint, a few things noticing this past week, and we'll continue to watch as we move forward here. Number one, watching the armyworms, as armyworms were, really found pretty heavily last week in the wheat. Kind of what we're seeing now in some areas, they're kind of moving out of the wheat and looking for something a little greener in some cases. Sometimes that's moving into a cornfield. So keep an eye on your corn for armyworms, as the bigger corn has kind of moved out of that susceptibility from cutworms. Definitely still in the stage where it could be eaten up by armyworms. Seeing some chemical carryover issues in some cornfields on some in rows, some corners, some point rows, things like that. If you remember back to the dry summer we had last year, that coming back, some of those herbicides that were applied maybe sticking around a little longer than what we'd want. On the herbicide front, especially on the corn side, a lot of cornfields, shouldn't say a lot, but some cornfields out there needing that post-application pretty quick. Into last week, the weekend, we did get caught up pretty good, but be mindful to get out there and keep the weeds out of the cornfields. As this corn grows, make sure you're paying special attention to the labels. As this corn starts approaching knee-high, there are some products that the corn is moving off the label on. And now as the corn enters this grand growth stage, it turns that deep dark green. That's really entering the susceptibility window for any type of brittle snap or heavy winds, making the corn much more susceptible to that. So for the month of June, we'd really like to continue getting adequate rains, but we don't want the violent storms and winds with them, as a lot of this corn crop is growing extremely fast and could be susceptible to some root issues or brittle snap issues as well. On the soybean front, cutworms in beans is probably the big news, something that doesn't happen very often. Many of us have really never seen black cutworms in beans, but they are out there in some places, mainly toward the southeast part of the states, probably where we're seeing more than anywhere. But at the same time, definitely be worth keeping an eye on your fields. As I mentioned earlier, some of the earlier planted beans are now been in the ground for 3 to 4 weeks. It's time for those post-application of herbicides. Again, use overlapping residuals to make sure we're controlling the water hemp and keeping that stuff at bay. From a wheat standpoint, like I mentioned, armyworms are pretty well sprayed last week. Disease cycles are pretty well running their course in the wheat field, and all we really need to do at this point is finish some grain fill and dry down. With that said, these temperatures we're experiencing in the low 90s, definitely not a good thing as wheat. From a grain fill standpoint, we'd much rather see temperatures in the lower 80s than lower 90s. So there's the potential there that we could see maybe a slight reduction in test weight as we enter the grain fill period. It's pretty much running 6 to 8 to 10 degrees above normal. The wheat is coming on fast, as you can tell, so I would expect somewhat of a normal harvest, maybe by second, third week of June. For the most part, we should be cutting wheat in a lot of areas. With the recent storms that rolled through on Saturday night and Sunday night in a few areas, looks like there may have been some hail associated with some of that. The biggest thing on hail is that when you contact your adjuster, most of them are going to put you off for about a week to 10 days. And believe it or not, that's on purpose, because they're basically wanting to see that crop regrow and see what's going to happen. So if you do get a hailstorm come through your area, patience is the name of the game there to see how the crop's going to respond and how it's going to develop after that. As always, if you have any questions, please contact your local Pioneer rep. Thanks.